Cool. All right. Well, thank you everyone for being here, especially at such a end of the day session. Cool. So yeah, as I said, we are going to talk about metrics, how we can look at the world and future of open source through the numbers. We have a really great panel to talk about this particular topic with. Each of our panelists, I would say, have expertise in very different sectors of how we can quantify the state of open source. And it's a very interesting time to talk about this topic because I think across the board here, we're undergoing quite a renaissance when it comes to how we are quantifying the state of open source and what the trends are, what's happening, and what we can predict. And so it'll be very interesting to get their different perspectives. Maybe just to kick things off, if everyone can maybe introduce like the broad topics that you are familiar with, have been researching and working with, and then we can dive into some of the specifics. Dawn, you want to start?
I'll start since I have the mic. I'm Dawn Foster. I do work on the CHAOS project. So CHAOS stands for Community Health Analytics for Open Source Software. So we spend a lot of time defining metrics and creating tools to gather those metrics so that open source projects can look at various aspects of the project, see where maybe they could make some improvements, and then we help them make improvements and measure whether or not those improvements were successful or not. I have a really deep and broad background in open source. I've been doing this for 3 decades, I guess, something like that. And so I've done a little bit of everything, but lately I've been really focused in a couple of areas. So I've been sort of deep diving into forks and relicensing. So that was the keynote from earlier this morning, just because that's a topic that is timely and fascinating to me. I also spent a lot of time thinking about foundations and open source projects in foundations. And then I also spent quite a bit of time thinking about funding. So, and from the aspect of making our open source projects more sustainable, because we have loads of open source projects, more so than what we have people to actually sustain those open source projects. So how do we fund people, maintainers, and projects to make them more sustainable over time? So those are my interests in data.
Excellent. My name is Brian Douglas. On the internet, I'm bdougie on GitHub. And previously, I ran a company for 2 years called OpenSauce.pizza, which was developer insights into open source projects. Prior to that, I worked at GitHub for about 5 years for doing developer relations. So my former team's out there at the table. But my interest is actually 12 years ago, I learned how to code while getting my MBA. I have a finance degree. Open source was like my first step into I could actually build stuff. And that's got hooked. And my entire career is this, I'm going to go fix something or ask somebody to unblock me. And it blew my mind that I could just like message people and they would respond. So my approach with OpenSauce, my job today is the Linux Foundation. I work developer experience on the LFX platform. So I specifically approach this of can somebody else come into this project and do something? What's missing? And at OpenSauce, we focus on really contribution metrics, which is inclusive in non-code. So that project's still alive, but we're going to try to influence some of that stuff into the Linux Foundation and Linux Foundation projects. Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks very much. I'm Jennifer Barth. I am the founder of Symmetry, which is a small research consulting firm, but I'm also the Chief Research Officer at Open UK. So I came to Open UK via doing another project on open source and getting Amanda's name as somebody that I could interview for the work I was doing. And after that interview, she asked me if I wanted to work with her to develop our entire reporting structure that we have today. So I became the Chief Research Officer, and we started to put together reports to varying degrees, but now we're at a nice pace of maybe 4 or 5 research reports a year, and they span, of course, AI is our most recent, skills, a focus on the economic impact, which is the piece I'll probably speak most about today, the economic impact of open source. But our mission and our kind of focus on creating what we feel is now becoming quite a think tank or a thought leadership organization is around bringing the submarine of open source under the UK economy up into where we can see it, where we can value it, where we can talk about it, we can see the people that are making it go. So even when I reflect back on the last 4 years of doing this work, it has changed so much what we can talk about, what we can share, and the commitment to open source and being part of the community. So that's the point of view I come from. I actually have a PhD in geography, so this was not at all what I was doing. I learned to code when I say that really loosely, when I started a master's at Goldsmiths around creative and social technologies, but that's led me to this place around the sort of interaction between socioeconomic change, people, places, things, and our technological sort of futures and emerging tech. So that's where I'll come from today.
Very cool. Thanks for sharing, everybody. So when we talk about metrics for any given open source project, there's typically a few lenses that we will be evaluating this on, right? There could be the impact, there could be sustainability, we could be looking at health of the community. A lot of these do get funneled into the lens of sustainability, and so I'd like to start with Dawn. There's often this narrative about, we're just trying to get as much money into open source as possible, and there's obviously not enough resources of any kind to go around. But some of your work highlights the fact that, when it comes to funding open source, it's not really so simple as just give money to project and good stuff happens, or how much of that good stuff is happening. And so I'm curious, your take, what are the primary axes of different metrics that you might look at to evaluate whether funding to an open source project has been successful or effective?
Yeah, so funding is an incredibly complex topic. And funding isn't always the answer for projects. There have been projects that have been given money and it created a really disruptive influence within the project because some people were getting paid, some people weren't, it caused hurt feelings. And in other cases, they just don't know how to distribute the money. And so it's not just throw money at things and things will get better. So one of a few people within the CHAOSS project, Georg Link and Kevin Lombard and Johan Lineker, have actually done some research where they went out and they interviewed a bunch of maintainers. So there's a paper out about that came out recently where they interviewed maintainers and talked to them about what worked, what didn't when they got funding. And it was kind of all over the board. And we've seen similar things as well. So I also do a little bit of consulting with the Sovereign Tech Fund and help them select projects. So they're a funding organization out of Germany, funded by the German government, and it's really interesting to look at these proposals. So the Sovereign Tech Fund funds critical infrastructure. So anything from this teeny tiny library that is used in so many research or scientific software packages to they provide funding for things like curl. So it's really, sort of all over the board. And then there are other funding organizations that fund for innovation. They fund for new things. So what are some, new projects in open source that we can fund? And the reason I say all of this is because funding is so incredibly complex that there is no one way to look at measuring the impact of it. Because you really need to look at what are the goals of the funding organization and what are the goals of the project. So, I see the proposals from the Sovereign Tech Fund, and they have very, very different milestones for, if you give us this money, this is what we're going to do with it, and in this time frame. And those are kind of all over the board. So you can't really measure those milestones against something else that's very different. So when you're looking at funding and looking at measuring the impact of funding, you really have to take it back to what you're trying to accomplish and what the project is trying to accomplish, and then measure the things that matter for that. So it's not a really simple answer. I can say also that we are next week launching within the CHAOSS project a funding impact measurement working group, along with my co-chair over there, Paul Sherratt. And so if you're interested in this topic of funding impact measurement, we are starting that working group up within the CHAOSS project next week. So we have our first meeting on Wednesday, and we're going to talk through all of these really complex topics and see if we can come up with some common things that we can do to measure funding impact.
I suppose if anyone wants to chime in on that, you're welcome to, or we can keep going. Okay. Well, then I guess, one follow-up that I would want to ask for something like this is, having these kinds of studies and reports that we can publish on the impact and efficacy of these things is all great, but hopefully this research actually impacts how we are funneling money towards different projects. And I'm curious if you might be able to speak to any, has there been any uptake of this kind of research? Have you seen it impact any of the way where different organizations are actually distributing funding or anything like that? Or is this in a very early stage where we're still just trying to figure out what we're measuring and how we do it? Where are we in this journey right now?
Yeah, it feels like we're in the very early stage. It feels like, a lot of, there's a lot of experimenting around with funding models for open source projects to see what works. But we are in a space right now where we need to start measuring the impact of that funding because, governments and companies, there's like FOSS funds, there's all sorts of, within companies, they're not just going to continue to give people money to put into open source project if somebody can't come back and say this is the impact. So the same thing with, ones that are, given money by, the German government or the EU. They're going to have to be able to go back and say, this was the impact of that money that you gave me, so please give me more. So if we want to sustain this, we really do need to find ways to measure the impact of it. But it feels like right now it's kind of in its infancy. There's a lot of experimentation, a lot of learning, and and right now it's some mix of quantitative metrics that we can look at and actually talking to the maintainers to see what happened with that money that we gave them and whether it was useful.
Yeah, I was just going to add, because I was thinking, it's worth mentioning that GitHub's running the Secure OS Fund, and I don't represent GitHub here, but it's like, if you want to ask them about that, they're out there. But I remember talking to Microsoft right after they delivered like $2,000 checks to a bunch of projects, because I was running a company, and I was like, hey, what's the impact for that? And a lot of that's just put your hand in the air and hey, was it good or bad? And the outcome of that is the Secure OS Fund through GitHub. So they're trying to attribute, on the GitHub side, to attribute security in funding. Not my job to tell you if it's good or bad, but just saying that it's worth looking into.
Yeah, and even that is going to be, I think, challenging on a lot of different fronts because even there's lots of attempts to measure security of different projects, but if you just look at CVE counts, there's a lot of problems with that kind of measurement. There's SSF scorecard and these other tools, and so I think there's a lot of work to be done there. Yeah, Jen?
Yeah, I would also add to what extent you understand the community building around any funding. So there's an example from some UK government money that was given to a group that are actually a plumbing organization to do an open source energy efficiency system. And they did this beautiful thing and they were kind of left with nowhere to go. So no community build, no connections, no sense of the ecosystem. They built within their own little world and then they didn't quite know how to go from there. So it's a really salient point that's made around, some people are getting paid, some people aren't, and then extrapolating that to what that looks like to even be able to grow, to sustain, to build, has everything to do with understanding the community. And I think some funders forget that that's an important, everybody ends up in silos.
Yeah, just to add to that, some of the funders like CZI, for example, and their most recent round, they're actually providing some workshops to some of their fundees to help them understand what they can do with this funding, how they can build these communities, how can they come out of this program stronger, so that it's not just we're going to give you a bunch of money, but we're going to give you money and resources and tools to make things better over time.
Yeah, I mean, the last thing that I can add to this also is that we're starting to do some work with a few different organizations around seeing how the impact of any kind of funding will reflect itself in the adoption rates of different organizations with the project. So, does that have more users come on board? Does that have them actually, convert to being real users and even contributors of the project, and what those rates look like? Let's keep going. So this one is for Brian. So for those that, I guess maybe just to say a little bit more about OpenSauced, you built a lot of different tools on top of contributor data, and I think there were a lot of very unique and less obvious lenses that you were looking at, contributor growth and these kinds of metrics for projects. What were some of the top unconventional metrics that you were championing at OpenSauced? And I'm very curious what impact those metrics had on projects.
Yeah, so we really tried to keep it simple. I'm not a data scientist or a researcher, but I just had an itch to scratch. So a year ago, got into a bunch of Postgres data on GitHub projects. So we 320,000 GitHub projects have over 100 stars. So we just took that data set and started there, which is mostly accessible through the GitHub archive, if anybody wanted to try this at home. And then we looked through that data and then tried to identify 4 different metrics that kind of really put our hat to. And one of them was repeat contribution. Other was first-time contributors, like what that rate was. And first-time contributors, but also outside contribution. So usually a core group of folks who maintain a project. How often do outsiders come in and make contributions? And then we started looking at this 4th metric, which we called confidence. And confidence was the ability of somebody to come back. And actually, confidence was the ability to make a contribution. Repeat contribution or repeat confidence was a separate thing. And that was the thing I really sort of focused on. And we were, at the time we sold the company, we were 10 people. So at this time we were 6. We didn't have a lot of staff and resources that would go beyond this, but confidence became super interesting to the sense of we had a percentage of everyone who interacts with the project, like what's the confidence that someone would make a contribution. And most large projects were less than 10%. So pick your big projects. Like Kubernetes was like 5%. Apologies. Kubernetes is actually higher. It was like 14%. But most other projects similar to that size were around 5%. And then projects that had like really good, I'd call them like hand-holding experiences, like extensions or plugins or like smaller projects that talk to the big projects, they were close to like 25%. And then JavaScript projects were kind of crazy. They were like 35 to 40. And it's just more of like, what's the barrier of entry? And I think what we were really trying to solve, I was talking to Brendan Burns the summer before this, and Brendan Burns co-created Kubernetes, and he was talking about they spent a lot of time really trying to make it like have a structure that people can walk into. So the question that I was trying to answer for him through this like sort of project that I was doing last year was, could you tell if this project was like accessible, approachable for a first-time interactor? And we were not just looking at code contributions, any comments. We did look at stars, but the ability of someone to star and then make a contribution, we followed that pipeline as well, and that was all engulfed and within this confidence percentage. And it was just eye-opening. I would love to do more work and go further and maybe like help with like the chaos and what you all are doing, but I think there's like more to sort of unearth. There's way more I could talk to you. Like we also worked with Carnegie Mellon about recognition and reputation. We wrote a whole blog post on Open Source blog about this, and higher confidence projects had high reputation folks who would recognize newer folks as well, sort of pull them in. So we were kind of tracking towards that influence part of this as well.
I saw some of your writing that was talking about the impact of some of these metrics on the perceived value that these projects were delivering, I guess. I'm curious, can you maybe talk about this and what the relationship of these metrics and the perceived value was, and maybe define that too? Yeah,
it's so I worked with a lot of VCs. Like we were a VC-backed company. So we talked to a lot of VCs. We also got invites to talk to a lot of open source first companies that were also taking VC money. And a lot of folks, so like they have this thing called the Ross Index. Rooter Capitals has an office out here in London. And it was measuring frequency of stars, GitHub stars in particular. And that perceived value of like if you get 1,000 stars in a week, like this is a very good project. Or if you get 100,000 stars, I think actually anything over 15,000 stars is top 1% on GitHub, if you look at the numbers. But jQuery has 54,000 stars. And I'm a JavaScript dev, and jQuery is in maintenance mode at this point. Like there's not future features that are going to be coming through jQuery. So everything's skewed. And what we were really trying to do is like take away that sort of vanity of metrics and focus on like I was going to say impact, but like, yeah, like what's the outcome that you're looking for? Because not every project is the same. Like a jQuery to Kubernetes is not the same. It's not apples to apples. So some projects don't need a lot of contribution. Some projects do. Some projects have a lot of funding. Some don't. So we were really trying to abstract away from vanity and rah, like make contributions. Yes, we wanted to do that, but we wanted to like take a step back and do like first principles. I don't know if that's like it's a buzzword you hear all the time, but like we did want to focus on something that was like meatier so we can stand on stage and talk about what we discovered as non-researchers in this startup.
I guess the perceived value aspect is a really interesting one, and I think a very good segue into Jen's work. Jen, I'm curious what your thoughts are on the relationship between the perceived value of open source, or really just any way that a project might estimate their economic impact versus what the actual economic impact might look like. What does the relationship between those look like?
Well, I think we're sort of getting at it, that there's very quantitative numbers and data and ways of looking at things, but there is a huge amount of qualitative factors that go into this. And I mean, I'm not going to lie, I always go to that. It's my natural habitat is to think qualitatively, but in all the work I do, the question of how you would get productivity numbers when it's time savings, which is one of the ways in which we understand open source, or innovation, or the quality of the work just getting better, or the value of a community. So when you look at what is adoption, what is use, whether something's filling a need, it's also producing all of this, all of these other factors that are very, very difficult to quantify. So the perceived value is usually something like it's filling a need, and that leads to adoption rates, and it leads to more people, and hopefully it would lead to more skill development and jobs and funding and sponsors and recognition, business models, wrapping things on top of it, various ways that you can go out there, and all of those things is the kind of result and the economic impact, I guess, of the perceived value. And it comes back around as you keep going. But just as easily, if you can't value the community behind something, if it's not getting the funding, but it's beautifully run by volunteers, if it's a public good rather than a private sort of output, how on earth do you recognize those things? So I don't have the answer to that. I think that's what almost all of the work we're doing is about. And it's taking things like, it's exactly what Brian's saying about we're actually looking at stars and data, but we're actually looking at relationships. And we're looking at why something can do well. And so we've worked really hard to try to, get the economic value. We've done different ways of doing that. Our most recent attempt is around just looking more at like the market shaping factors, what we need to look at. And we looked at these 8 factors, and not many of them are quantitative. So procurement, yes, skills can be quantified, but not enough. Not as far as we would want. The voice, so how loud are you speaking? How well are you heard? Do you have a voice in this community? I'm not going to remember all of them. IP, obviously, is more quantifiable. That's also something we use in all of our research. You know the innovation of a company by how well it's, by its IP creation, right? So you don't always see that in numbers for open source. So all these things that kind of qualitative infect and are part of the perceived impact. So in my opinion, we need to better, make visible those factors and continue to figure out ways to see them. And I think some of the work that we've been talking about today is exactly that. And the problem everybody keeps coming up to is a number is good, and we put lots in, and we thank very many people like SCARF and Runa Capital and GitHub for the great data they help us get. We also go out in surveys and we get data from people, but we also need to keep raising the qualitative factors and the values that underpin it, and try to keep, I think that's a big, push forward around impact and perceived impact and sustainability of open source.
Yeah, I mean, this is definitely one of the hardest questions to crack, I think, on this topic. But I think one of the very, obvious North Star metrics in terms of just like what is the overall economic impact of open source? Why does any of the stuff that we're doing even matter, right? And the figure that gets thrown around a lot is that $8.8 trillion dollar number. And I think, Jen, as you outlined, there's a lot of qualitative things that go into this. There are some quantitative things that go into this, and they all have their faults and limitations and such. But I'm curious, given the state of this research right now, what are the primary things that we as an open source community will need to be focused on to maximize that number over the next 5 years? Like what does the data suggest that we should be looking at?
It's for me.
Yeah.
I'll take a stab, and then they can add. So one of the issues, to the point I keep sort of overstating, is that for the 8.8 trillion, and the work by Nagel and others, and at Harvard and Linux are, is really wonderful, and they're very committed to that work. When you look at labor, for example, you can only see what's in any kind of available data set. So what are the labor costs of employees in your business? How do you manage their productivity numbers? And so you don't see all those other people who are doing the work. You don't see what's behind creating open source. You don't see contributions in the same way you should, because you can only understand, and really in almost all the research that's out there, it's just a limitation. It's the best way anyone can do it right now. So we need to have much more understanding of the way people work, how to value that work. I think that would be one key thing in understanding the real impact. Other things are just being able to shed more light on cost savings and how that really works in organizations. We need to make the data open. Some of that data was not openly available from the 8.8. I think if you opened that story up, you would get a lot even more rigorous work out of that. I'm trying to think what else. Labor is my big one. And I think and the other thing is that contributors often don't say where they're from. That's getting better, which is really interesting. It's getting better, but you actually can't always see the true value of anybody's work because of the way in which they've made their mark in GitHub, for example. So people putting that out there so we can see more of the work and get real numbers and continue to share. And I think my last point would be that collaboration. So we get data from different places, and it jives and it makes sense, but sometimes you can see the limitations of one data set or one analysis because of the limitations of a data set. So opening up your data, and particularly probably proprietary data from the big companies would actually make that much easier.
Now let's move on to some questions that I think will be broadly applicable to all.
Yeah,
Oh, sorry.
I was just gonna add,
Go ahead.
part of the work that I'm actually starting at the Linux Foundation for the LFX platform, actually it's touching on this, and actually have that Harvard study that came out last year open up in a tab. So I think the number was like 96% of all open source contributions happen from 5% of the contributors, which is amazing. So then when you take that $1 trillion number, like each one of those contributors are contributing $1 billion worth of code. So I skimmed, I read it on the plane on the way over, so I don't have much context else to provide, but that actually stood out pretty big.
Okay, so these are going to be more broadly applicable questions, so just feel free to, anyone who is resonating with the question, feel free to take it. What commonly used open source metrics do you think are fundamentally flawed or misleading or not as useful as they're cracked up to be?
Lines of code.
That's very fair. I think a lot
lines of code touch. It's another vanity thing where it's just like, it depends on the project, depends on the person, depends on the type of work. Before Open Source became a company, we had worked with another company to identify types of contributions, and this was like before AI was accessible, and like I didn't even know what to do with it. But we put stuff in, we did a heuristic to find out what type of contribution was being made. And I think we took VS Code and found out that like 98% of those contributions come from employees of Microsoft, which is not a surprise. But the majority of that is actually maintenance. So we sort of bucketed it and tried to find out, okay, what were net new features that came out of the VS Code project that were moving the project forward, and what was just keeping the thing alive? And that was interesting. I would love to actually do that again as a little side project. Now I have access to a lot of data and models and know what I'm doing now.
Yeah, just to add to that, despite the fact that I used lines of code as a big part of the Forks relicensing research, you really can't look at it in isolation because one of the things I noticed was in one of the projects, a whole bunch of those lines of code was like a formatting PR. And so you could attribute most of the lines of code changed to a single formatting PR. So you really need to, you can't just like look at that and not go deeper. But the other one I would say is stars. So it's not that they're worthless. Like, celebrate them. You got lots of stars, that's, it's a popularity, it's a vanity metric. But it doesn't actually tell you anything about the health of the project, right? So you can have super unhealthy projects that are really dysfunctional, but have loads of stars because, lots of people use them for whatever reason. So that's one of the ones that I feel is a little bit misleading, is stars.
Yeah,
That's fine.
Jen agrees. I was just going to say, like, I've got 3 kids at home, and each kid is very different. Like, one's like super in your face, like needs your attention at 7 a.m. The other one's like, hey, could you please come out of your room? We should eat together. It's like completely different, and we treat each kid, we meet them where they are. And like, going back to, you can't look at one metric and make a judgment. And it's, at Open Source, we really wanted to like not make hard truths within the data we were sharing. We just wanted to show things that we were seeing, because you got to look at the full picture and then sort of paint your picture together. So, I wanted to add on to what you were mentioning.
So when you look at the the future trajectory of open source broadly, and this could be at the entirety of open source or within more specific communities, what do you see as the biggest risks that open source is facing, and what metrics should we be looking at to see how we're tracking on mitigating them?
Sorry, I'll just jump in. There's a metric that so in the Chaos project, was it Pony Factor? Is that, where did you guys end up?
We related on contributor absence factor.
Contributor absence factor, which is the Nebraska factor, the bus factor, lottery factor. That's really interesting. So there was a project that and I'll get to a point because I had a whole podcast where I chatted about this. There's a project that, PG Vector. Anybody heard of PG Vector?
Mm-hmm.
So PG Vector is like embedded in anybody who's doing Postgres in your AI company, like using PG Vector to make AI work. And that's how you raised your huge round last year. PG Vector has a lottery factor of 1. One person decided during the pandemic to basically solve this problem in Postgres to make AI approachable. This one person also was an early employee at Instacart. So personally wealthy because he lived through the IPO. So it's just like scratching an itch, doing open source. You cannot open an issue and get a response. You cannot get your pull request merged. Like, this project is dependent on so many different AI companies. But this person just happens to be like, hey, I did a thing. I'm so happy that people are using it, but I don't have time to respond to stuff. So what we're seeing right now is we're seeing PG Vector clones, like MySQL has one that PlanetScale shipped as well, that's open source. So then you're looking at this influence that's coming from startups and companies that are controlling the future of what's happening in specific niches of technology. So I think it's one thing that to really pay attention to is like who is like pulling the strings behind the scenes, but also who's this, it's just here, like clone it. If you like it, go clone it, fork it, do whatever you want. That world still exists, but stuff is taking off at least in the AI side that I've been looking at.
Yeah, +1 to that. I think that's probably one of the most important metrics to look at. The other one I really like to look at, and this gets back to the Forks relicensing thing, is organizational diversity, or within the Chaos project, we've called this the elephant factor. So how many companies, employees at companies are involved, and is a project dominated by a single company? Because what happens in those cases is you can think that company's fantastic. They'll always be open source. They're wonderful. They're perfect. They're great for open source. But companies get acquired by, companies that aren't great. We'll just leave it at that. Companies change strategies. Companies run out of money. They go out of business. So when you have these projects that are completely dominated by the employees at a company that are dependent on being paid by that company to do this project, that can cause projects to just completely implode, or they relicense and they fork. There's lots of things that can come out of that, but I would be really skeptical of projects where all the contributions come from the employees at a single company.
And saying the same thing as these two to much less well. And then also, so I think this all wraps up to transparency, I think it all wraps up to communication, knowing what, who, where, and this is what so much of the work we're talking about is trying to get at, and very difficult.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one way or another, the future of open source, I think, is really going to hinge on our ability to do all of these things more effectively, right? To really optimize the work that we are all doing and how effective it all is. And so I thank all of you for being here to be interested in this kind of thing, because I believe that over the next few years we're going to continue to see a more data-driven open source community that really helps us get the most out of all of the work that we are putting in. Personally, I think it's been a long journey of a lot of advocacy around things that were a lot more touchy and less popular, around things like project usage analytics tracking. And I think one way or another, I think a lot of the data collection and research and analysis that is happening across different domains in open source, there's a lot of challenges, there's a lot of difficulty with it, but it's something that really, when everyone chips in, this all goes a lot further. And then, so to wrap up, I guess, from each of you, I'm very curious, what would be either advice or asks for the open source community, in terms of like what things everyone should be tracking, or how everyone can be best chipping in towards, creating a more collaborative open source ecosystem in terms of how we are measuring and tracking how everything is doing. What advice or ask would you give to the audience that's listening?
I can start.
Sure.
Mine would be in line with everything I've said, which is just being transparent, making sure that you're aware of contributions, how you're tracking things, how you're talking about things, how you're sharing, and being a good community member always at the base of what you're doing is going to help everything rise up and come together and start to produce better statistics and data.
Yeah, I only disagree with what was said already, which is like self-report. Like if you're at a company that's doing open source, like talk about it. And if you can't talk about it, find out why and see if you can get permission to talk about it. But also the work that happens outside of work. I think companies would benefit if you attributed, hey, I'm doing this stuff and it's on my time, but I work at this company. There's a lot of back and forth and conversations that can be had within the engineering orgs or whatever the work that you're doing to help self-report and like let us find out what's happening. So if we see a pony factor happening, I was going to share another story around a fruit company in Cupertino. There was a dependent on a certain project in the CNCF, and Grafana essentially hired all of them. And it was a huge uproar what happened a couple of years ago, and that's the type of stuff like we should tell those stories and find out how we can sort of not replace people, but when people ascend to the cloud and to big companies, like always find out how we can sort of bring other people up.
Yeah, and related to that, think about all of the stuff you're not measuring. So open source projects are not just about, lines of code committed. It's basically like a product, right? Everything that has to happen within a company to make a product successful, we need in our open source projects. So there are all of these skills that sort of get forgotten. And I really wish maintainers thought more about that, because I think most maintainers that I know spend more time than they realize on things like marketing and community management and communications and the things that someone else who does that kind of for a living and knows a lot about how to do that could do that way more efficiently than a maintainer who's just sort of trying to figure it out. So I really do wish that people would think more about how they could get help from other types of people to make our projects more diverse and more well-rounded, and also get more people involved who can help reduce the load on these poor, overworked, burnt-out maintainers.
All right, and with that, we are right out of time. So thank you to our panelists. Thanks everybody for listening, and hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.